When Catherine first felt the small lump in her breast during a routine morning shower, she almost ignored it. After all, she was only 34, had no family history of cancer, and was in the best shape of her life, but something deep inside her whispered that this tiny bump would change everything she thought she knew about strength, love, and what it truly means to fight for your life. What started as a whispered concern to her husband over morning coffee would soon become a battle that would test every relationship in her life, challenge her faith, and ultimately reveal a strength she never knew existed. This is not just another cancer story. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about what happens when life forces you to choose between giving up and discovering who you really are, when everything familiar is stripped away. Catherine's journey through the darkest months of her life, leading up to what would become the most meaningful Christmas she'd ever experienced, proves that sometimes our greatest victories come disguised as our worst defeats. Her story will make you laugh, cry, and ultimately believe in the incredible power of the human spirit to not just survive but to transform pain into purpose and fear into unshakable hope. Catherine Martinez had always been the type of person who planned everything 3 steps ahead. Her morning routine was precise, her work schedule organized, and her life seemed to follow the neat timeline she had mapped out years ago. At 34, she had built a successful marketing career, maintained a loving marriage with her husband David for 8 years, and was finally feeling ready to start the family they had been discussing. The Tuesday morning that changed everything started like any other. Catherine stepped into the shower at exactly 6:15, the same time she had every weekday for the past 5 years. The water temperature was perfect. Her favorite lavender body wash filled the air with its calming scent, and NPR played softly from the bathroom speaker. She was mentally preparing for a big presentation she would give that afternoon when her hand moved across her chest during her usual washing routine. There it was, a small, firm bump just above her left breast.
Catherine froze, her hand pressing against the spot, as if she could somehow make it disappear through sheer willpower. She had done monthly self-examinations since college, following her doctor's advice religiously, but had never found anything unusual.
This felt different from the normal tissue around it, harder, more defined. Her heart began racing as she tried to rationalize what she was feeling. Maybe it was just a cyst. Women got those all the time. Maybe she was imagining things, or maybe it had always been there and she just hadn't noticed. She spent another 10 minutes in the shower repeatedly checking the area, hoping that somehow the lump would reveal itself to be nothing more than her imagination playing tricks on her. But it remained, solid, real, undeniable. Catherine stepped out of the shower on shaking legs, wrapping herself in her favorite blue towel while staring at her reflection in the mirror. She looked exactly the same as she had yesterday. Her shoulder-length brown hair was still damp and curly, her green eyes still bright, her skin still glowing with the health that came from her regular yoga practice and careful diet. Nothing about her appearance suggested that anything was wrong, yet she could feel the small intruder that had somehow taken up residence in her body. She dressed mechanically, her mind spinning with possibilities she didn't want to consider. By the time she made it to the kitchen, David was already at the counter, pouring coffee into his favorite mug while scrolling through news on his phone. He looked up with his usual morning smile, the one that had made her fall in love with him 12 years ago when they met in college. "Morning, beautiful. You ready for your big presentation today?" he asked, reaching over to squeeze her shoulder affectionately. Catherine opened her mouth to tell him about what she had found, but the words stuck in her throat. How do you casually mention over morning coffee that you might have found something terrifying in your own body? How do you shatter the peaceful normalcy of a Tuesday morning with news that could change everything? Instead, she forced a smile and accepted the cup of coffee he offered her. "I think so. I've been preparing for weeks." David studied her face, with the intuition that came from 8 years of marriage. "You seem a little off. Everything okay?" This was her opening, the moment when she could share her fear with the person who knew her better than anyone else in the world. But looking at his concerned face, seeing the love and trust in his dark eyes, Catherine found herself protecting him from her worry, at least for a few more hours. "Just nervous about the presentation," she lied smoothly. "You know how I get." He kissed her forehead gently. "You're going to be amazing. You always are." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Catherine went through the motions of her usual routine, but every few minutes her hand would unconsciously drift to the spot where the lump sat, a constant reminder that something had fundamentally shifted in her world. During her commute to work, she found herself researching breast lumps on her phone, falling down a rabbit hole of medical websites that only increased her anxiety. The internet, as it often did with medical concerns, provided every possible scenario, from completely harmless to absolutely devastating. Catherine learned about fibroadenomas, cysts, lipomas, and a dozen other benign conditions that could cause lumps, but she also read about inflammatory breast cancer, invasive ductal carcinoma, and survival statistics that made her hands tremble as she held her phone. By the time she reached her office, Catherine had convinced herself that she was probably overreacting. She was young, healthy, and had no family history of breast cancer. The logical part of her mind insisted that this was most likely nothing serious, but the growing knot in her stomach suggested that her intuition was preparing her for something her rational mind wasn't ready to accept. Her presentation that afternoon went surprisingly well, despite the fact that she could barely concentrate. Her colleagues praised her thorough research and innovative marketing strategy, and her boss hinted at a possible promotion. Under normal circumstances, Catherine would have been thrilled. Instead, she felt like she was watching someone else's life unfold while she observed from a distance. After work, she drove straight to an urgent care clinic without telling David where she was going. She couldn't spend another night wondering and worrying. She needed answers, even if those answers weren't what she wanted to hear. The urgent care doctor, a kind woman in her 50s, named Dr. Patel, examined Catherine with gentle professionalism. Her face remained carefully neutral as she palpated the area, but Catherine caught the slight furrowing of her brow that suggested concern. "I can definitely feel what you're describing," Dr. Patel said carefully. "It's about the size of a marble, quite firm, and relatively well-defined. While most lumps in women your age turn out to be benign, I think it would be wise to get this evaluated further." The word benign should have been reassuring, but Catherine found herself focusing on the phrase "most lumps," which implied that some lumps were not benign. Patel referred her to a breast specialist and ordered an ultrasound to be completed within the next few days. "Try not to worry too much, Doctor," Patel said as she handed Catherine the referral papers. "We're just being cautious. But I'm glad you came in quickly. Early detection is always our best tool." Early detection of what? Catherine wanted to ask, but she was afraid of the answer. The drive home gave her time to process what had just happened. In the span of 12 hours, she had gone from a woman with a perfectly ordinary life to someone who needed specialists and medical tests. The shift felt surreal, like she had somehow stepped into someone else's reality by mistake. David was in the kitchen preparing dinner when she walked through the front door. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the air, and soft jazz played from their Bluetooth speaker. Everything looked exactly as it had that morning, but Catherine felt like she was seeing their home through different eyes. Would this be the last time she would walk through that door, as someone who didn't have to worry about cancer? Would she look back on this moment as the end of their carefree phase of marriage? "How did the presentation go?" David asked, not turning around from the stove where he was stirring what appeared to be his famous pasta sauce. Catherine set down her purse and walked over to him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind and pressing her cheek against his back. She needed to feel his warmth and strength before she told him what she had discovered. For just a moment she wanted to pretend that everything was still perfect in their world. "David," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Something in her tone made him turn around immediately, his hands coming up to frame her face. "What's wrong?" "You look scared." The concern in his voice nearly broke her resolve to stay calm. Catherine had always been the strong one in their relationship, the planner and problem solver who handled crises with grace. David was more emotional, more intuitive, and she knew that her fear would immediately become his fear, magnified by his love for her.
"I found a lump this morning," she said simply.
"In my breast. I went to urgent care after work, and the doctor wants me to see a specialist." David's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, then understanding, then the same fear that Catherine had been carrying all day. But then something else appeared in his features: determination, resolve, the look he got when he was preparing to fight for something important. "Okay," he said, his hand still holding her face gently. "What do we need to do? We, not you. We." In that single word, Catherine felt some of the crushing weight she had been carrying alone all day begin to lift. Whatever this turned out to be, she wouldn't face it by herself. "I have to call tomorrow to schedule an ultrasound and an appointment with a breast specialist," she explained. "The doctor said most lumps in women my age are benign, but they want to be sure." David pulled her into a tight embrace, and Catherine let herself lean into his strength for the first time since that morning. She felt his lips press against the top of her head and heard him take a shaky breath. "We're going to handle this," he said firmly. "Whatever it is, we're going to handle it together." That night, Catherine lay awake long after David had fallen asleep beside her. She listened to his steady breathing and watched the familiar shadows that the streetlight cast on their bedroom ceiling. Everything looked the same as it had the night before, but she felt fundamentally changed. The woman who had gone to sleep the previous evening had been blissfully unaware of the small mass growing in her body. Tonight's version of herself was someone who understood that life could change in an instant, that the security she had always taken for granted was more fragile than she had ever imagined. She found herself making bargains with the universe. If the lump turned out to be nothing serious, she would never take her health for granted again. She would eat better, exercise more, stress less about work deadlines and household chores. She would focus on what really mattered: her marriage, her relationships with family and friends, her dreams of starting a family. But even as she made these promises, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that this was just the beginning of a journey she had never planned for.
The Catherine who had stepped into the shower that morning had been someone who believed that bad things happened to other people. The Catherine who now stared at the ceiling in the darkness was beginning to understand that she was not immune to life's cruelest surprises.
The next morning, Catherine called the breast specialist's office as soon as they opened. The scheduler's voice was professionally cheerful as she explained that the next available appointment was in 10 days.
10 days, that suddenly felt like an eternity. Is there any way to get in sooner? Catherine asked, trying not to sound desperate.
I just found this yesterday and I'm quite concerned. Let me check with the doctor, the scheduler said. Sometimes we can work people in if it's urgent.
The word hung in the air like a warning. Catherine was learning a new vocabulary, one filled with medical terms and implications that she had never needed to know before.
20 minutes later, the scheduler called back. Dr. Morrison had a cancellation for Friday afternoon. Can you be here at 3:30? Friday was still 3 days away, but it was better than 10. Catherine accepted the appointment and then called her boss to explain that she would need to leave work early for a medical appointment. She kept the explanation vague, not ready to share the details with anyone beyond David. The ultrasound appointment was scheduled for Thursday morning, which meant she would have test results to discuss when she met with the specialist the following day. The logistics of managing her medical care were already becoming complicated, requiring her to rearrange work meetings and coordinate schedules in a way she had never needed to do before. As Wednesday turned into Thursday, Catherine found herself becoming hyper-aware of her body in ways she had never been before. Every small ache or pain seemed potentially significant. She caught herself repeatedly checking the lump as if it might have changed overnight. Sometimes she thought it felt larger, other times smaller. She began to question whether she was imagining variations that weren't really there.
David, meanwhile, had thrown himself into research mode.
Catherine would find him late at night with his laptop open reading medical studies and survival statistics. She knew he was trying to prepare himself for whatever they might face, but seeing him study cancer survival rates made her own anxiety spike.
Maybe you should wait until we know what we're dealing with, she suggested one evening when she found him deep in research.
He looked up at her with tired eyes. I need to understand what we might be facing. I need to know how to help you. His dedication was both comforting and terrifying. Catherine realized that her diagnosis, whatever it turned out to be, would affect both of their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. The ultrasound appointment felt like stepping into a different world entirely. Catherine had never paid much attention to medical facilities before, but now she found herself noticing everything with sharp clarity. The waiting room was filled with women of all ages, some accompanied by partners or family members, others sitting alone with that same expression of controlled anxiety that Catherine recognized from her own mirror. The ultrasound technician, a woman named Maria with kind eyes and gentle hands, tried to keep the atmosphere light as she prepared Catherine for the procedure.
Just try to relax, Maria said, squeezing warm gel onto Catherine's chest. I know that's easier said than done, but the more relaxed you are, the better images we can get.
Catherine stared at the ceiling tiles as Maria moved the ultrasound wand across her skin, trying to interpret the technician's expressions and the mysterious black and white images that appeared on the screen. She had seen ultrasound pictures before, usually happy occasions when friends were showing off images of their unborn babies.
This felt entirely different. Instead of looking for tiny fingers and toes, they were searching for something that didn't belong in her body. Can you see anything? Catherine asked, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. Maria's face remained professionally neutral. I can see the area you're concerned about, but I'm not qualified to interpret what we're seeing. Morrison will review these images and discuss everything with you tomorrow. The non-answer was somehow more frightening than any definitive statement would have been. Catherine dressed slowly after the procedure, her mind spinning with all the things Maria hadn't said. If it were obviously benign, wouldn't the technician have been able to offer some reassurance? If it were clearly concerning, wouldn't there have been some urgency in her voice? The drive home gave Catherine time to call her mother,
something she had been putting off since finding the lump. Linda Martinez was a worrier by nature, and Catherine knew that sharing this news would cause her mother considerable anxiety. But she also knew that keeping it secret would be worse if the news turned out to be serious. "Hi, sweetheart," her mother answered on the second ring. "How's my favorite daughter doing?" Catherine smiled despite her anxiety. She was her mother's only daughter, but the endearment had been a running joke between them for years. "I'm okay, Mom, but I need to tell you something." The shift in her mother's tone was immediate. "What's wrong?" Catherine explained about finding the lump, the urgent care visit, and the upcoming appointment with the specialist. She tried to keep her voice calm and matter-of-fact, but she could hear her mother's breathing become more rapid as the story unfolded.
Oh, honey,
Linda said when Catherine finished. "I wish you had called me sooner. Do you want me to come with you to the appointment tomorrow?" The offer was tempting.
Catherine's mother was a retired nurse who had worked in oncology for 15 years before switching to pediatrics. She would understand the medical terminology and know what questions to ask.
But Catherine also knew that having her mother there might make the appointment feel more serious and frightening than it already did. "David's coming with me," Catherine said. "But maybe you could be on standby, just in case we need you."
of course. I'll keep my phone on my schedule clear.
"And Catherine, try not to spend tonight Googling everything. Most of what you'll find will just make you more anxious." Her mother's advice was sound, but Catherine had already violated it extensively over the past few days. She had read about every possible type of breast cancer, memorized survival statistics, and learned more about chemotherapy and radiation than she had ever wanted to know. The internet had been both a source of reassurance and terror, often in the same paragraph. That evening, David suggested they go for a walk around their neighborhood, something they used to do regularly but had gotten away from as their work lives became busier. The October air was crisp and filled with the scent of fallen leaves. Halloween decorations adorned many of the houses they passed, and Catherine found herself wondering if she would feel like celebrating anything by the time the holiday arrived. "Remember when our biggest worry was whether we could afford to refinish the hardwood floors?" David said as they paused at the corner where their street intersected with the main road through their subdivision. Catherine laughed, but it sounded hollow even to her own ears. "That was last month. It feels like a different lifetime." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Catherine noticed things she had never paid attention to before. The way the setting sun created long shadows across the sidewalk, the sound of children playing in backyards somewhere nearby, the smell of someone's dinner cooking that drifted from an open window. Everything seemed more vivid and precious than it had just a few days earlier. "I keep thinking about all the things I've been putting off," Catherine said as they turned toward home. "Like visiting my grandmother more often, or taking that photography class I've been talking about for years. It's funny how something like this makes you realize how much time you waste worrying about stupid stuff." David reached for her hand. "Don't talk like you're dying. We don't even know what this is yet."
I'm not talking like I'm dying.
Catherine replied, though she realized that wasn't entirely true. "I'm just thinking about what's important. Maybe that's not such a bad thing regardless of what we find out tomorrow." The appointment with Dr. Morrison was scheduled for 3:30 on Friday afternoon, but Catherine and David arrived 15 minutes early. The breast center was part of a larger medical complex, modern and efficient but somehow more welcoming than the typical doctor's office. The walls were painted in soft blues and greens, and the furniture was comfortable rather than clinical. Dr. Morrison turned out to be younger than Catherine had expected, probably in her early 40s, with short auburn hair and a direct but kind manner. She invited Catherine and David into her office before the examination, which Catherine appreciated. She needed to know something about the person who might be delivering life-changing news. "I've reviewed your ultrasound images," Dr. Morrison began, settling behind her desk with Catherine's file open in front of her. "I can see why Dr. Patel wanted you to come in. There's definitely a mass there, about 2 centimeters in diameter, and it has some characteristics that warrant further investigation." Catherine felt David's hand find hers under the desk. "What kind of characteristics?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. "The mass appears to be solid rather than fluid-filled, which rules out a simple cyst." "Doctor," Morrison explained, "the edges are somewhat irregular and there are some internal echoes that could indicate several different things. The good news is that it appears to be relatively well contained and hasn't spread to your lymph nodes, at least not visibly." The phrase "relatively well contained" suggested that it could still be contained in an absolutely concerning way. Catherine was learning to read between the lines of medical speak, understanding that doctors were trained to be cautious with their language until they had definitive answers.
What's the next step? David asked. I'd like to do a core needle biopsy, Dr. Morrison said. It's a minimally invasive procedure where we use ultrasound guidance to take several small tissue samples. It's the only way to know for certain what we're dealing with. The word biopsy hit Catherine like a physical blow, even though she had been expecting it. Until that moment, there had been room for hope that the ultrasound would reveal something obviously benign. Now they were talking about taking pieces of the mass and examining them under a microscope for cancer cells. How long before we get results? Catherine asked. Usually 3 to 5 business days. I know that feels like forever when you're waiting, but it gives the pathologist time to do a thorough analysis. Morrison scheduled the biopsy for the following Tuesday, which meant Catherine would spend the weekend in limbo, not knowing whether the mass in her breast was trying to kill her or was simply an inconvenient but harmless growth. The weekend passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. Catherine and David went through the motions of their usual Saturday and Sunday routines, but everything felt different. They cleaned the house, went grocery shopping, had dinner with friends, but Catherine felt like she was acting in a play about her own life rather than actually living it. Sunday evening, Catherine's sister Rebecca called from Seattle. Their mother had clearly shared the news, despite Catherine's request that she wait until after the biopsy results came back. Mom told me what's going on, Rebecca said without preamble. I wanted to call sooner, but I wasn't sure if you wanted to talk about it. Catherine felt a mixture of annoyance and relief. Annoyance that her mother hadn't respected her wishes, but relief that she no longer had to carry the secret alone. Over the past few days, she had found herself feeling isolated from friends and coworkers who had no idea what she was going through. It's okay, Catherine said. I'm kind of glad she told you. It's been weird having this huge thing happening and not being able to talk to anyone about it. What can I do? Rebecca asked. I could fly out there if you need me. I don't even know what I need right now, Catherine admitted. Everything feels so uncertain. I keep going back and forth between thinking it's probably nothing and planning my funeral. That sounds completely normal for someone in your situation, Rebecca said. When do you get the results? Probably Thursday or Friday. This is the book It's About History, Rebecca said for a while. The biopsy is Tuesday morning. They talked for another hour, with Rebecca sharing stories about friends who had gone through similar scares that turned out to be nothing serious. Catherine appreciated the attempt at reassurance, but she had read enough medical statistics to know that not everyone's story had a happy ending. The biopsy appointment arrived with surprising speed. Catherine had been dreading Tuesday morning for days, but when it finally came, she felt oddly ready to get it over with. The procedure itself was less traumatic than she had anticipated. Dr. Morrison used a local anesthetic, and while Catherine could feel pressure and movement, there was no significant pain. I'm taking 4 samples, Dr. Morrison explained as she worked. That should give us plenty of tissue for a comprehensive analysis. Catherine stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about the fact that pieces of her body were being removed and would soon be examined by a stranger in a laboratory somewhere. The whole process took less than 30 minutes, but it felt like a significant milestone in what was becoming her journey through the medical system. You might have some bruising and soreness for a few days, Doctor, Morrison said as she bandaged the biopsy site. Try to avoid any heavy lifting or strenuous exercise until Thursday. And Catherine, try to stay busy this week. The waiting is often the hardest part. Staying busy turned out to be easier said than done. Catherine found it impossible to concentrate on work projects that had seemed important just a week earlier. Everything felt trivial compared to the possibility that she might have cancer. She caught herself staring out her office window, wondering if this might be the last autumn she would see, or if she would live to celebrate another Christmas. David, meanwhile, had become almost aggressively normal in his behavior, as if he could will their lives back to their previous state through sheer determination. He planned elaborate dinners, suggested weekend trips, and talked about future projects around the house as if nothing had changed. Catherine appreciated his optimism, but she also found it exhausting to pretend that everything was fine when they were both clearly terrified. Wednesday evening, Catherine decided she needed to tell her boss about what was happening. She had been taking time off for medical appointments without explanation, and she knew that pattern would likely continue if the biopsy results required additional treatment. Sarah Chen had been her supervisor for 3 years and had always been understanding about work-life balance issues. I'm dealing with a medical situation that might require some flexibility over the next few weeks, Catherine explained during their private meeting. She kept the details vague, not ready to say the word cancer out loud until she knew for certain that's what they were dealing with.
Sarah's response was immediately supportive.
Of course. Take whatever time you need and let me know how I can help redistribute your workload if necessary. The kindness in her boss's voice nearly made Catherine cry. She was learning that people's compassion could be as overwhelming as their own fears, and that sharing her burden actually made it feel heavier rather than lighter. Every person who knew about her situation became someone else she had to worry about disappointing or devastating with bad news.
Thursday morning arrived without the phone call. Catherine had been both dreading and anticipating. She checked her phone obsessively, jumping every time it buzzed with a text message or email notification.
By afternoon, she had convinced herself that no news was bad news, that Dr. Morrison was taking extra time because the results were complicated or concerning. David found her pacing in their kitchen when he came home from work. "Still nothing?" he asked, though her agitation made the answer obvious.
"Maybe I should call them," Catherine said. "It's been 3 days."
"They said 3 to 5 days. It's only been 2.5 days, David pointed out gently. The biopsy was Tuesday morning. They probably didn't even get the samples to the lab until Tuesday afternoon. His logic was sound, but Catherine's anxiety wasn't interested in logic. She had convinced herself that waiting meant bad news, that good news would come quickly, and bad news would require careful consideration of how to deliver it. Friday morning brought rain and gray skies that matched Catherine's mood perfectly. She had barely slept, jumping awake every few hours to check her phone for missed calls. By 10 o'clock, she couldn't stand the suspense any longer and called Dr. Morrison's office. "The results actually just came in this morning," the nurse told her.
"Morrison would like to see you this afternoon to discuss them. Can you be here at 4 o'clock? Catherine's heart sank. If the results were good news, couldn't they have shared that information over the phone?
Requiring an in-person appointment suggested there were complicated discussions ahead.
"Should my husband come with me?" Catherine asked.
"That's entirely up to you, but Dr. Morrison generally recommends bringing a support person when we're discussing biopsy results." The afternoon crawled by with excruciating slowness. Catherine tried to eat lunch but found that food tasted like cardboard. She attempted to work on a project that was due the following week, but the words on her computer screen seemed to swim together meaninglessly. David left work early to pick her up, and they drove to the appointment in uncharacteristic silence. Catherine found herself memorizing details of the drive. The way the afternoon light filtered through the clouds, the songs playing on the radio, the feel of David's hand holding hers across the center console.
If this appointment brought devastating news, she wanted to remember what it felt like to still be innocent of that knowledge. Dr. Morrison's expression was carefully neutral when she greeted them in her office. Catherine tried to read her face for clues about what they were about to hear, but the doctor's professional demeanor gave nothing away.
"Thank you both for coming in," Dr. Morrison began, settling behind her desk with Catherine's file. "I wanted to discuss your biopsy results in person because there are several things we need to talk about." Catherine's heart was beating so hard she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. David's hand found hers again, and she held on like he was the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. "The biopsy showed that the mass is malignant," Dr. Morrison said gently but directly. "You have invasive ductal carcinoma, which is the most common type of breast cancer." The words hit Catherine like a physical blow, even though she had been preparing for this possibility for over a week. Hearing the actual diagnosis spoken out loud made it real in a way that all her fears and research and sleepless nights hadn't quite achieved. Cancer. She had cancer. "However," Dr. Morrison continued, "there are several factors that make me optimistic about your prognosis. The tumor is relatively small, it appears to be well contained, and your lymph nodes look clear. We caught this early, which gives us excellent treatment options." Catherine felt like she was hearing the doctor's voice from underwater. Words like treatment options and prognosis swirled around her, but her mind kept repeating the same phrase. "I have cancer. I have cancer. I have cancer." David was asking questions about staging and treatment plans, his voice steady despite the fact that Catherine could feel his hand shaking in hers. She was grateful that he was able to think clearly, when her own mind felt like it had shut down entirely. "What happens now?" Catherine managed to ask when there was a pause in the medical discussion. "Now we get you connected with an oncologist and start planning your treatment." Dr. Morrison said, "I'm going to refer you to Dr. Amanda Foster at the Cancer Center. She's one of the best breast cancer specialists in the city, and I think you'll work well together." The Cancer Center, another new phrase in Catherine's rapidly expanding medical vocabulary. She was about to become a cancer patient,
Someone who would spend her time in treatment centers and oncology offices instead of marketing meetings and client presentations. Is this going to kill me? Catherine asked bluntly, unable to dance around the question any longer.
Dr. Morrison's expression softened.
With early-stage invasive ductal carcinoma like yours, the 5-year survival rate is over 90%.
This is very treatable, Catherine. You're going to fight this, and you're going to win.
90% sounded encouraging, but Catherine found herself thinking about the 10% who didn't survive 5 years. Would she be in the lucky majority, or would she become one of the statistics that made other women's survival rates possible?
The drive home was quiet. Both Catherine and David lost in their own thoughts about what they had just learned. Catherine felt strangely numb, as if the emotional impact of the diagnosis hadn't quite caught up with the intellectual understanding of what it meant.
"We should call your mom," David said as they pulled into their driveway. Catherine nodded, but the thought of having to say the words, "I have cancer," out loud to the people she loved felt overwhelming. Once she started making those phone calls, there would be no more privacy around her diagnosis. It would become a fact that other people knew, worried about, and would want to discuss and manage.
That evening, Catherine made the hardest phone calls of her life. Her mother cried, as Catherine had expected, but then immediately shifted into planning mode, offering to take time off work to help with appointments and treatment.
Rebecca bought a plane ticket before their conversation ended, insisting that she needed to be there for whatever came next. Catherine's father, typically pragmatic, asked about insurance coverage and treatment options. Her best friend Emma offered to research everything she could about breast cancer and connect Catherine with other survivors she might know. Everyone wanted to help, to do something concrete to fight this disease that had invaded their loved one's body.
By the time all the phone calls were finished, Catherine felt emotionally drained, but oddly relieved. The secret was finally out, shared with all the people who mattered most.
She no longer had to pretend that everything was normal or carry the weight of her diagnosis alone. That night, she and David lay in bed holding each other, both afraid to voice the fears that were keeping them awake. Catherine's mind raced with questions about what treatment would be like, whether she would lose her hair, how long she would be sick, whether they would still be able to have children someday. But underneath all those practical concerns was a deeper, more primal fear that she was only beginning to acknowledge.
She was 34 years old, and she had cancer. Her body, which had always been reliable and strong, had betrayed her in the most fundamental way possible. The future she had carefully planned was gone, replaced by an uncertain path through a medical system she had never wanted to navigate. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Catherine's last conscious thought was a strange mixture of terror and determination. She had cancer, but she was still alive, and as long as she was alive, she was going to fight.
The oncology center looked nothing like Catherine had expected. Instead of the sterile, depressing environment she had imagined, the building was filled with natural light and decorated with artwork created by patients and survivors.
Children's drawings hung alongside sophisticated paintings, creating a gallery of hope and resilience that spoke to the diverse community of people who passed through these halls. Amanda Foster turned out to be exactly the kind of person Catherine needed in her corner. In her mid-50s, with graying hair and laugh lines around her eyes, she had the confidence that came from years of helping people fight cancer and the compassion that made her chosen specialty bearable. Within minutes of meeting her, Catherine felt like she was talking to someone who genuinely cared about her as a person, not just another case to be managed. "I've reviewed all of your test results and images," Dr. Foster said, spreading Catherine's file across her desk. Dr. Morrison was right to be optimistic. "This is very treatable. We have excellent options for someone with your type and stage of cancer." She explained that Catherine's tumor was estrogen receptor positive, which meant it fed off hormones that her body naturally produced. While this might sound frightening, it actually meant they had additional treatment tools available. Hormone therapy could be used along with traditional chemotherapy to attack the cancer from multiple angles. "I'm recommending a course of chemotherapy first, Dr. Foster continued. "We call it neoadjuvant therapy when we do chemo before surgery. The goal is to shrink the tumor as much as possible before we remove it. After surgery, we'll likely do radiation therapy and then long-term hormone therapy to prevent any recurrence." Catherine tried to process the timeline Dr. Foster was describing. Months of chemotherapy, then surgery, then radiation, then years of hormone therapy. What had started as a small lump in her breast was about to become the central organizing principle of her entire life for the foreseeable future. "When would we start?" David asked, taking notes on a legal pad he had brought specifically for medical appointments. "I'd like to get started within the next 2 weeks. Doctor," Foster said, "we'll need to do some additional tests first."
A CT scan to make sure the cancer hasn't spread anywhere else, some blood work to check your overall health, and we'll need to discuss fertility preservation. Fertility preservation.
Catherine had been so focused on the immediate threat to her life that she hadn't considered what cancer treatment might mean for their hopes of having children. The chemotherapy drugs that might save her life could also destroy her ability to become pregnant.
We definitely want to have kids someday, Catherine said, her voice small. Are you saying that might not be possible after treatment? Foster's expression was gentle but honest. Some chemotherapy drugs can affect fertility, and we won't know how your body will respond until after treatment is complete. But there are things we can do beforehand to preserve your options. We can harvest and freeze eggs before we start chemotherapy, so you'll still have the opportunity to have biological children later. Another procedure, another timeline to coordinate, another way that cancer was rewriting the story Catherine had planned for her life. But it also represented hope for a future beyond treatment. A belief that she would survive this disease and have the chance to build the family she and David had dreamed about.
The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of medical appointments and preparations. Catherine met with a reproductive endocrinologist who explained the egg harvesting process.
She had blood drawn for what felt like dozens of different tests. She sat still for CT scans that took pictures of her entire body, searching for any signs that the cancer had spread beyond her breast. Each test brought its own anxiety and relief. The CT scan came back clean, showing no evidence of cancer anywhere else in her body. Her blood work showed that she was otherwise healthy and strong enough for aggressive treatment. The egg harvesting procedure retrieved 18 viable eggs, more than the doctors had expected for someone her age. All of these positive results should have made Catherine feel better, but instead she found herself struggling with a growing sense of unreality. She was still going to work every day, still paying bills and doing laundry and having dinner with friends, but underneath all of these normal activities was the constant awareness that she had a disease that could kill her. The night before her first chemotherapy treatment, Catherine stood in front of her bathroom mirror and ran her fingers through her hair. It was thick and healthy, falling in natural waves to her shoulders. Within a few weeks it would all be gone. She had bought scarves and researched wig options, but she couldn't quite imagine herself bald.
"Are you okay?" David asked from the bedroom. Catherine joined him on their bed, curling up against his side.
I keep thinking about how different everything is going to be. 3 months ago, our biggest worry was whether we could afford to renovate the kitchen. Now I'm about to start chemotherapy. Do you remember what you said to me on our wedding day, during your vows? Catherine smiled, remembering.
"I promised to love you through whatever life brought us, whether it was easy or hard. I don't think either of us imagined it would be this hard, this soon," David said. "But I meant those vows too. We're going to get through this together." The first chemotherapy session was both more and less frightening than Catherine had anticipated. The infusion center was comfortable and well-appointed, with large chairs that reclined like first-class airplane seats and individual television screens for each patient. The nurses were experienced and kind, explaining each step of the process as they prepared Catherine's IV and began the slow drip of medications that would hopefully save her life. Catherine had brought a book, her laptop, and a playlist of upbeat music, but found herself too nervous to concentrate on any of them. Instead, she watched the other patients around her and marveled at their apparent calm. Some were reading, others were napping, a few were talking quietly with family members who had come to keep them company.
First time? Asked the woman in the chair next to hers.
She appeared to be in her 60s with a colorful headscarf wrapped expertly around her head and an easy smile. "Is it that obvious?" Catherine replied.
You have that deer in headlights look? I remember it well. I'm Patricia, and this is my 4th round of chemo. It gets easier, I promise. Patricia became Catherine's informal guide to the world of cancer treatment. She explained which anti-nausea medications worked best, how to manage fatigue, and most importantly, how to maintain hope when everything felt overwhelming. Over the course of Catherine's treatment, Patricia would become not just a fellow patient, but a true friend.
The physical effects of chemotherapy were both predictable and surprising.
Catherine had expected to lose her hair, and it began falling out exactly 2 weeks after her first treatment, coming out in handfuls in the shower, until she finally asked David to help her shave off what remained. She had prepared for nausea, and while the anti-nausea medications helped, she still spent several days after each treatment feeling queasy and exhausted. What she hadn't expected was how chemotherapy would affect her emotionally. The steroids they gave her to prevent allergic reactions made her feel anxious and wired. The fatigue was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a bone-deep exhaustion that made simple tasks feel monumental. Some days taking a shower required as much energy as running a marathon used to take. Work became increasingly difficult as treatment progressed. Catherine's boss had been understanding about her need for flexibility, but Catherine found it hard to concentrate during her good days and impossible to function during her bad ones.
The marketing campaigns that had once excited her now felt trivial in the face of her fight for survival.
I think I need to take a leave of absence, Catherine told David after a particularly difficult week when she had missed 3 days of work due to treatment side effects.
Are you sure? David asked.
You've always said that work gives you a sense of normalcy. It did at first, Catherine admitted. But now it just feels like I'm pretending to be someone I'm not anymore.
I'm not the same person who used to stay late to perfect a client presentation. I'm someone who spends her days fighting cancer, and that requires all of my energy right now.
Taking leave from work was both liberating and frightening. Liberation came from no longer having to pretend that she could maintain her previous level of productivity. Fear came from the realization that cancer had now taken over not just her health but her professional identity as well. The weeks blended together in a routine of treatment, recovery, and preparation for the next round. Catherine learned to schedule her life around her chemo cycles, planning activities for her good days and accepting rest on her difficult ones. She discovered that some foods that had always been favorites now tasted metallic or made her nauseous. She learned to nap without guilt and to ask for help without feeling weak. Through it all, her support system proved to be stronger than she had ever imagined.
Her mother took time off work to stay with Catherine during her worst days, making soups and smoothies when solid food was unappealing, and sitting quietly nearby when Catherine was too tired to talk. Rebecca visited every few weeks, bringing care packages filled with soft blankets, gentle skincare products, and books by authors Catherine had never heard of but came to love.
Friends organized meal trains and house cleaning schedules. Coworkers sent care packages and cards.
Even casual acquaintances reached out with offers of help and words of encouragement.
Catherine learned that sharing her struggle had revealed a network of love and support she had never fully appreciated before. But perhaps the biggest surprise was discovering her own strength. The Catherine who had always planned 3 steps ahead found herself learning to live day by day, sometimes hour by hour. The woman who had prided herself on maintaining control over every aspect of her life discovered that she could survive in a world where cancer called the shots. As October turned into November and then December, Catherine began to notice small signs of progress. Her most recent CT scan showed that the tumor had shrunk significantly. Her blood work indicated that her body was responding well to treatment. Dr. Foster was optimistic that they would be able to proceed with surgery after the holidays. Surgery.
The word that had once terrified Catherine now felt like a milestone to be celebrated. If they could operate, it meant the chemotherapy was working.
It meant she was winning her fight against cancer. I want to talk about Christmas, Catherine said to David one evening in early December. They were sitting in their living room, Catherine wrapped in the soft throw blanket that had become her constant companion during treatment. What about it? David asked. I want it to be perfect, Catherine said. I know that sounds silly, but I keep thinking that this might be my last Christmas. And even if it's not, it's definitely going to be my last Christmas, as someone who's actively fighting cancer. I want it to mean something. David set down the book he had been reading and turned to face her fully. What would perfect look like? Catherine had been thinking about this for weeks. I want all the people I love in one place. I want to cook even if I can only manage one dish. I want to tell everyone what they mean to me. I want to celebrate not just Christmas, but the fact that I'm alive to celebrate it. They sent invitations for Christmas dinner to both of their families, close friends, and even Patricia, who had become like an adopted grandmother. Catherine's energy was limited, but her determination was limitless. She planned the menu around food she could actually taste and enlisted help for everything she couldn't manage herself. The week before Christmas, Catherine received news that made the holiday even more meaningful. Her latest blood work showed that her cancer markers had dropped to nearly normal levels. The tumor, which had been 2 centimeters when she was first diagnosed, was now barely detectable on imaging. This is exactly what we hoped to see, Dr. Foster told her during their appointment. You've responded beautifully to treatment. We'll schedule your surgery for early January, and I'm very optimistic about removing whatever cancer remains. That night, Catherine called everyone she loved to share the good news. The relief in their voices was palpable, as if they had all been holding their breath for months and could finally exhale. Catherine realized that her cancer diagnosis hadn't just affected her. It had impacted everyone who cared about her, creating a community of people who were invested in her survival. Christmas morning arrived crisp and clear, with fresh snow covering their neighborhood like a blessing. Catherine woke up feeling better than she had in months, energized by anticipation and hope.
She had lost her hair, gained new scars, and learned more about fear than she had ever wanted to know. But she was alive, surrounded by love, and winning her fight against cancer.
A house filled with family and friends throughout the day. Catherine's grandmother, who was 92 and rarely traveled anymore, had insisted on coming to be there.
Rebecca and her husband flew in from Seattle. David's parents drove down from Chicago.
Patricia arrived with homemade cookies and stories that made everyone laugh until their sides hurt. As they gathered around the dinner table, Catherine asked for a moment of silence before the meal. But instead of a traditional prayer, she wanted to share what the past few months had taught her. 6 months ago, I thought I knew what strength meant, she began, looking around the table at faces that had become even more precious to her through this ordeal.
I thought strength meant having a plan and sticking to it, controlling outcomes and never showing weakness. Cancer taught me that real strength is different. It's getting up every day when you don't know what the day will bring. It's accepting help when you've always been the helper. It's finding reasons to laugh when you have every reason to cry. She paused, her voice catching slightly with emotion. It's also recognizing that none of us fights alone. Every single person at this table has carried me through the hardest months of my life. You've shown me what love looks like when it's tested, and you've proven that some things are stronger than cancer. Catherine raised her water glass, since alcohol was still off limits during treatment. So this Christmas, I'm not just celebrating the birth of hope 2,000 years ago. I'm celebrating the hope that each of you has given me, the hope that I'm going to see many more Christmases, and the hope that none of us will ever face our hardest battles alone.
The toast that followed was accompanied by tears and laughter, the perfect combination for a celebration that honored both the pain of the past months and the promise of the future. As Catherine looked around the table, she realized that cancer had taken many things from her: her hair, her energy, her sense of certainty about the future. But it had also given her gifts she never could have anticipated. She had learned that she was stronger than she knew, that her relationships were deeper than she had realized, and that hope could survive even in the darkest circumstances. She had discovered a community of survivors who had become mentors and friends. Most importantly, she had found a new appreciation for the simple miracle of being alive, surrounded by love, with the chance to fight another day. The surgery in January went perfectly. Dr. Foster was able to remove the remaining tumor with clear margins, meaning they had gotten all of the cancer. The pathology report showed that the chemotherapy had been even more effective than they had hoped, with only microscopic traces of cancer cells remaining. Catherine's radiation treatments began in February and continued through March. Unlike chemotherapy, radiation was a daily commitment, but with milder side effects. She was able to return to work part-time, easing back into a professional life that now felt both familiar and completely different. By the time spring arrived, Catherine's hair had begun to grow back, coming in curly and darker than before. She joked that cancer had given her the natural curl she had always wanted. More importantly, her energy was returning and her scans continued to show no evidence of disease. As the first anniversary of finding the lump approached, Catherine found herself reflecting on the year that had changed everything. She had entered this journey as someone who believed that bad things happened to other people, that careful planning could prevent most disasters, and that strength meant never showing vulnerability. She emerged as someone who understood that life was inherently uncertain, that love was more powerful than fear, and that true strength came from the willingness to keep fighting even when the outcome was unknown. She had learned to live with gratitude for each day while still making plans for the future, to accept help while still maintaining her independence, and to find joy in small moments while never losing sight of larger dreams. The woman who had stepped into the shower on that October morning had been someone who took her health, her future, and her relationships for granted. The woman who now stood in the same bathroom, running her fingers through her growing hair, was someone who knew exactly how precious and fragile all of those things were. Catherine's story became one of survival, but more than that, it became a story of transformation. Cancer had tried to define her, but instead she had defined herself through her response to cancer. She had chosen hope over despair, community over isolation, and courage over fear. As she prepared for what she hoped would be many more Christmases to come, Catherine carried with her the knowledge that she had faced her greatest fear and emerged not just intact but stronger than before. She had learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can also become the source of our greatest growth, our deepest connections, and our most profound appreciation for the gift of simply being alive. The spotlight she had never wanted, the one that had illuminated her cancer journey, had also revealed the strength she never knew she possessed. And in sharing her story honestly, including the fear and the hope, the setbacks and the victories, Catherine had discovered that her experience could become a source of light and strength for others walking the same difficult path.
She had found her voice in the darkness, and that voice had become a beacon of hope for anyone who needed to believe that cancer could be fought, survived, and ultimately transformed into a source of deeper wisdom and greater love.